Is there more to midlife than just getting through it? Absolutely. Welcome. I'm your host, Debbie Cunningham, jazz artist turned midlife mentor, and I'm here to say to you loud and clear, it's time for your midlife crescendo. Well, hey everybody, welcome back. Today on the podcast, we are talking about forgiveness and consequently how unforgiveness can affect our health as women in any season of life. Our guest is women's trauma therapist Melanie Eddy, who has been on the show several times, and I'm so excited to welcome her back. Now, this is a topic that was requested from our survey participants. But before we dive in, I just want to say we all have things we've had to forgive. I certainly have. But some are more painful and traumatic than others. So please hear me at the beginning. This episode is not about telling you what to do in your painful circumstance. It is about helping you move into and through midlife as the healthiest version of yourself. Over the years, doctors have learned how much mindset affects our health and well-being long term. One of the doctors I've learned so much from is Dr. Carolyn Leaf. She is a brain specialist I follow on Instagram and I've read some of her books. She says when we forgive in the quantum science world, we are disengaging ourselves and literally severing that connection to the other person who hurt you, which enables you to heal. By not forgiving, you stay connected to the source of your pain, literally plugging yourself into that toxic energy every day, and it makes it difficult for you to heal. Neurologically, unforgiveness can activate stress responses, leading to changes in brain function and structure. We know as midlife women, we are already battling brain fog and memory loss as our estrogen decreases. We've learned in previous episodes how important our mindset is as we go through menopause to our overall health. Last week, we just talked about how complaining actually affects our brains. And you can go back and listen to that in episode 41. Hanging on to unforgiveness will throw you into toxic stress. This is not just a nice to know you skill or Pollyanna idea. Unforgiveness literally constricts blood vessels around your heart and sets you up for a stroke or heart attack. It reduces the amount of oxygen to your brain. Learning to forgive is a life skill. How we manage our mindset matters, and it influences our mental and physical health throughout our lives. So here's my conversation with Melanie. Well, hey, everybody. Today on the podcast, I have Melanie Eddy. She is a women's trauma therapist. We've had her on the podcast several times before, and I am so glad to welcome you back, Mel.
Well, hi, Debbie, and hi, listeners. It's so good to be back on the show.
Well, normally the first question I always ask is, tell us something about yourself that we don't know, but we've done that so many times before since you are a recurring guest. So what I want to ask you is, what has sparked the most joy in your life in the last few months?
Well, what comes to mind is, there's a couple things. First of all, we have been blessed with a grandson. His name is Ezra, and he is just turned 3 months old.
Oh, that's so exciting, baby. Grandbaby number 2.
Grandbaby number 2, and he's just a delight. And it's just so sweet to see Ava, who is 2, interact with him. So that's one. And then just so grateful for the recovery that I've received after having rotator cuff surgery. This year has been very difficult. And so I'm really grateful that I've gotten movement back and
Back to playing pickleball.
yes,
That's exciting.
I'm back to playing pickleball. So I'm just so grateful because I know that so many struggle with chronic pain or illness and, they don't get that kind of relief. So I'm very mindful that this is such a gift that I've been given. So I'm grateful for that. That brings me joy to be able to move. Now, my knees and the other aches and pains because of postmenopause, that's a whole nother thing. But I won't complain, Debbie.
Yes.
because you just talked about how complaining affects our body. So I'm just gonna just be like, yes, I'm happy for the joy that I have now.
Yeah, gratitude, gratitude. Especially as we move into November and in the US, we celebrate Thanksgiving and we try to focus on gratitude. We need to focus on gratitude 365 days a year to help our minds stay in the right
Yes.
place. But yes,
Yes.
it's awesome. And I'm so grateful for your recovery. And I'm so happy to have you back on the podcast. I've missed our conversations. Well, today is interesting and it's a little heavier subject because we're talking about forgiveness and unforgiveness, but I think it's such an important topic in midlife because when we're younger and we're in our really busy years, whether we're raising a family or just building a career, we're very busy and focused on other things. But then we hit midlife and we do a lot of introspection and reflection, and we find that maybe some things that we find these themes in our lives of perhaps resentment or people that we didn't realize we were struggling to forgive seems to be larger than life in midlife. I don't know why that happens, but it does. And it seems that those are things that can really hold us back from this great midlife season where it can be a crescendo, not a downward spiral like so many people like to say. But I really wanted to talk about forgiveness because, as I said in the intro, it's not just this Pollyanna, nice person idea of forgiving people. It's literally scientific and neurological things that affect our brain and our bodies when we enter into unforgiveness, and it affects our lives, it affects our health. So I wanted to talk to you today about forgiveness as a trauma therapist. You're hearing a lot of hard stories, so let's talk about, you give your perspective on what you see in women's lives when they are living in unforgiveness and struggling with unforgiveness perhaps.
Yeah, I see what I see is a lot of very difficult things that are happening, experiences that my clients have had, whether it's been childhood trauma, childhood abuse, or, maybe they are surviving a relationship, they're leaving a marriage because they have been abused and mistreated. I see a lot of family estrangement that is very difficult for my clients to go through. Sadly, I have even had to counsel parents where their children just stop talking to them. They get angry with them, and instead of trying to work it out, they just stop talking to them, and there's just no room for reconciliation. It's really sad. So helping them to navigate, because forgiveness can feel really foreign, because some people look at forgiveness as, well, I'm letting them off the hook if I just forgive them. And it's
Right.
not about letting them off the hook. It's about you letting go and releasing what you're holding on to. And so yeah, I see a lot of pain and suffering. Yeah, it's really hard to watch. It's really hard to listen to.
Let's start there because I want to say for all of the ladies listening that this is not a just forgive and go on kind of episode. I want you to understand we're actually going to dig down deep and we're going to talk about difficult things. Life is hard, and some of you have experienced deep trauma. People have done harmful things to you, and I want to acknowledge that right now. And we are going to talk about how unforgiveness affects us when we hold on to it thinking it's going to hurt the other person. Do you want to talk about that, Mel?
Yeah, there's a really popular saying. You hear it more so in 12-step circles. Unforgiveness, holding on to resentment is like swallowing a bitter pill and hoping it will poison the other person. But what it ends up doing is it literally ends up poisoning ourselves. It affects all assets of our bodies, as you heard in the intro, physiologically, spiritually, it can really affect our relationship with God. Because, when I think, and what I've witnessed and what I've experienced is that when we hold on to unforgiveness, sometimes it can make us feel shame. It can make us feel ashamed of ourselves. And that doesn't feel good. And so spiritually, it can make us say, well, gosh, I'm just a horrible person. I can't add up. I can't bring this, to God. It's too much. So it might make us, uh, kind of wander away from God. And physically, it does cause illness. It can cause digestive issues. And emotionally, it can cause us deep depression and turn us into hermits and recluses. And it can be very isolating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it I would say, and you and I have both have experiences in our life where we've had to forgive some difficult things. And one of the things it can do is it can make you hold God at arm's length
Yeah.
and not even approach him, because honestly, in your heart, you don't want to forgive because someone did something horrible to you. And also, how come they get to get off the hook here?
Right.
Right? You alluded to that, but that's really a core issue where it's really hard to forgive because you feel like you're giving someone permission to harm you, like, when you forgive them. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the process of that. Let's talk about maybe how you've experienced that in your own life, if you'd like to share that. Because what I think maybe some of you ladies need to realize is that we all struggle with unforgiveness.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Because at some point in your life, someone's going to do something, even if it's just resentment, because resentment is unforgiveness. God has taught me that over the years. And it's amazing to me when I said, okay, God, I'm resenting people. I feel this sense that I have some resentments I need to let go of. And then I had like 3 pages. I'm like, okay, just tell me who it is. And I'm like listing. I'm like, oh, I didn't know I was holding resentment toward that person and that person. But resentment and unforgiveness is a toxic energy that we cling to that affects our lives. So talk a little bit about the process even of approaching God with this, because it's hard to approach God with our to ask him to help us to forgive, because truly I believe in my heart of hearts that only God can equip us to forgive other people, and he has forgiven us of all of our sin. The Bible is very clear of that. If we believe that Jesus is the son of God and died on the cross for our sin, we are now forgiven of that sin. That activates the forgiveness of that sin. When we believe that he died for everyone, but when we believe that, that activates our forgiveness. And even in the Lord's Prayer, when Jesus was teaching his disciples to pray, he said, this is how you should pray. Forgive forgive us as we forgive those who have sinned against us. And I think that's a really difficult thing, especially when you in your relationship with God don't feel like forgiving.
Yeah, and I just want to say, because I know there's a lot of women listening where they have been harmed in such a way that they've gotten no acknowledgement from the other person. I think that one of the most difficult areas of forgiveness is when you go to another person and you say, this is what you did to me, you hurt me, and they don't take any responsibility for what they've done to you. Or you don't get an opportunity for them to say, I'm so sorry, that hurt you. That can feel really angering and frustrating. And I think that's one of the hardest things to forgive. And I want to talk about the fact that, I agree with Debbie when she said we need God to be able to forgive. Listen, forgiving is hard.
Yeah.
It's hard for me. It is a daily surrender, whether it's something minor as being in the car and somebody cuts you off, to a betrayal of some sort, family member, a friend. Forgiveness is hard. And we really do need to seek God for forgiveness. But because it feels so weighty and heavy, sometimes we don't immediately go to God. I know for me, I might feel bad about myself. How could I think such horrible thoughts about this person or want revenge? Like I'm actually surprised at the person that I can be in
Right. All of us.
humanness. Yeah, exactly. All of us. And so what I've learned how to do and what I tell my clients to do is actually start with what's true. And I have learned to really get honest with God because He's such a good Father. And we need to start with if we don't want to forgive someone or we don't feel like it, start with that. Say, Father, this is so hard for me. If I'm honest with you, I don't want to forgive this person. Like, spend
Right.
some time in lament, bring it to Him, bring all that raw honesty because He knows anyway. And when
Right.
we do, we don't see it happening, but He'll start to transform it. He'll start to transform our mind and our emotions. And forgiveness is a process. It's not going to be something that it's going to be one prayer and you're done. It's going to like be this ongoing counseling session that you're going to have with the Lord. It's going to
Hmm.
be this back and forth. It's really a transformation process, to say, I don't want to. And then you go from I don't want to Lord, help me to be willing. Help me, Lord, to be willing. To Lord, I
Yes.
want to be obedient to what your word says and what you want. And it really does happen. And I am somebody that my default setting is not to be like, oh, I forgive you. It's okay. Like, no, I no, I really, I'm like
She's being
seriously,
honest. Yeah, she is being
right?
honest. I know
Without
her.
Jesus, I would really, be a mess because my story is one that I grew up in a home where, and I have forgiven, just to say, I have forgiven my mother. I grew up in a home, my mother was emotionally abusive, she was physically abusive, she was a very angry person. She kept an account of wrongs. Like, I mean, the woman had a memory like an elephant. She could remember every horrible thing anybody ever did to her. And she literally had no friends. One little fault would come up with somebody and she would reject them and push them away. I mean, looking back now, it's really sad. And I understand as a therapist that she had unhealed trauma, but at the time it was really hard. So what I'm trying to say is that what she modeled for me is that you punish people, you get mad at them, you hold grudges, you get them before they get you. I mean, a child or a teenager is going to model what they grow up with, what they see their parents doing.
Right.
And so I had to really learn how to go to the Lord and ask Him to help me. And I still have to do it today. And then, ironically, my mother and father actually became the source of the biggest forgiveness that I ever thought I would ever have to do in my life. When I was in my 20s, I mean, it was a tumultuous relationship with my mother, and my father was passive and he didn't really get involved a whole lot. And, when I was in my 20s, I finally got into therapy and I learned and found out that I was being abused. And some of you out there have grown up in homes where you've experienced childhood trauma. That feels like you're normal. You're kind of like, well, this is normal. Well, it
Right.
wasn't. And my therapist kind of coached me into setting boundaries with my mother. And one day she was still verbally abusing me even when I was married with a baby. And I stood up to her and I said, shaking in my boots, my hands were shaking, and I said, "It's not okay that you talk to me this way like a robot," because I was I was terrified of her, but
Sure.
I also knew that it couldn't continue because I was dying on the inside, and I just couldn't be who God wanted me to be because I just was under this power of the trauma, and I just wanted to break free so I could walk in my identity of who God created me to be. And so I stood up to her. And by that evening, my mother and father made the decision that they would no longer be talking to me or see my children again. It made my mother mad. And she, like she did with all the people in her life, she did to her own daughter. And she said, "Oh, you don't like that? Well, I won't talk to you ever again." And
Yeah,
so,
it's
yeah,
crazy, the cancel culture and the
yeah.
canceling of in your relationship with your parents, that they would literally cut you off.
Literally cut me off, and it was very painful because I was adopted. It was already, it's hard, and that can be a whole nother subject, but
Right.
when you're adopted, you already are struggling with your identity. And so, long story short, I mean, there's a lot of in between. I was estranged from my parents for over 26 years. They were just gone out of my life. And it was really, really difficult for me. And there was no acknowledgement. They abandoned my children. I never got acknowledgement. I never got, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I know what I did to you." And what I ended up doing is that because of the trauma, and because, if I'm honest, I think I was so, so angry that this happened to me. And I was so bitter that I actually ended up imploding, really, depression,
Mhm.
anxiety. I spent years in food addiction, and I had to go into 12-step program to get recovery. I mean, it was really hard, and I did not want to forgive them. And if anything, I wished my mom such ill, and I didn't like who that made me. And so, after more trauma therapy and more healing and grief work and things like that, I got to a journey of, I need to forgive them. And the only way that I was able to do it was with God's help.
So, Mel, I know that after you did all of this work and all of this healing, and it took years, it was a process. But of course, as a friend, I saw you get healthier and healthier through those years, and God redeeming just the time and giving you a new lease on life. You became a trauma therapist to help other people. But God also brought some closure in your story. Can you talk a little about what the sweetness of God and what he did at the end of your parents' life, how he opened that door to you for a deeper forgiveness?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So, I prayed. You want to talk about a waiting season.
Yeah.
And let me just say, I'm going to just put this out there. I had an anger towards God too, even though I had faith and I never lost my faith. I was angry at him because I prayed for 20 some years. I'm like, I just want to see my dad again. I just want to be able to have some closure there. And so it was a very long wait. But now that I look back, I know God was refining me. And he's like, "You're not ready yet, Melanie. You're not ready yet, Melanie. Look, I can look." He wanted me to be strong. He wanted me to have worked on forgiveness and work on the letting go, so that when that day came, and it did, that I would be able to be in relationship with my dad in a healthy way. And believe me, it wasn't perfect. I had anger that came up. It was a daily forgiveness again because it brought up so much. But I was able to, when my dad was 91 years old, the doors open, so that I could be in his life again. My mother had dementia, so she didn't know it was me. So it was really interesting, so I could be in my dad's life. And my dad always wanted to be in my life too, but I think he was afraid of my mother and what she would do. So the door opened. And because I had all of that healing, and because I had done that forgiveness work, I actually had about 3 years that I could be with my dad up until the end of his life, in a way that, because I forgave, this miraculous compassion came out of me towards my father that I'm like, this is only God. This forgiveness, to being able to see my dad through eyes of compassion, like that was nothing but God. And again, it didn't mean that it was perfect. Sometimes my dad was cranky and mean towards me because he's aging, and I would get angry and say, you don't have a right to even
Right.
have a little bit of anger towards me. But, because of all the work I did and because I chose to forgive, I was able to have the closure that I really truly needed. I really needed that closure. I really needed that peace. And I was able to have that. And I recognize that that is not everybody's story. They don't get to
Right.
have closure. And here's the other thing. This is a big one. I never ever got from my father, I am so sorry for what we did to you, because he was aging. He looked at me and he said, "Why haven't I seen you?" As if I was gone a week.
Right. Right.
And I said, "Well, a lot happened, Dad." But because I had compassion and unforgiveness and bitterness wasn't running me, so to speak, I was able to say, could I sit here and beat him up and tell him all the horrible things? I could, but I chose to say it was really difficult, Dad. But let's just focus on the now. But if I hadn't done that work, that forgiveness work, I wouldn't have been able to have that ending, because I could have remained bitter. I could have been like,
Sure.
I'm never going to talk to you again. That's that. But I really did. And even to this day, I feel at peace. And I was actually at my mother's bedside when she passed away in hospice. And I felt at peace. I'm going to be honest with everybody, with our listeners. I didn't really feel endearing towards her. I just felt neutral. There really wasn't a relationship there. I was relieved, to be honest with you, and that's normal to feel relieved after you've been abused if a parent passes away. That's a whole nother topic. But I just felt like this peace. There was an ending. I could be there with my dad.
Can I say something I remember about that story that when you told me what had
Yeah.
happened? So I remember though, your mother's dementia is actually was the caveat that enabled you to be brought back into your dad's life because he called you because
Yeah.
she had dementia.
Yeah.
And then you came, but you were there by her bedside and God gave you a moment to forgive her then. Like, do you remember that?
Right. So it wasn't at her bedside. So
Okay.
actually, it was sitting at the kitchen table. And I think it's really unbelievable. So my mother started to stare at me, and I was like, uh-oh, she's remembering who I am. But in that moment, she had tears in her eyes, and she said, you're the girl that I gave a hard time to. You're the girl that I gave a hard time to." And I said, "Yes, that's true. That's right." And but again, because I've forgiven her, I said, "But that's all over now." And I really struggled with it because I'm like, I don't want to be in this codependent dance where,
Right.
I'm denying my feelings. And, it wasn't that. It really wasn't that. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to take care of you and deny my feelings. Like, I
Right.
really felt like a healed adult. And she honestly, to me, was like a 5-year-old little girl.
Right.
Like, I actually had compassion. I actually sat there and I thought, what happened to you?
Right.
Like, what happened to you? And really, it was only because of the transformation that God did in me and in my heart. And he did it because he wanted me to be at peace, and he wanted me to be free, and he didn't want me to suffer anymore.
Right.
And if I held on to forgiveness and bitterness and anger, I don't know where I would be. I really don't. I found that I didn't need them to say I'm sorry. I didn't need them really to do anything. But that's just my story. I'm not
Right.
saying that's going to be everybody's story because I suffered so much mentally. So much mentally. I had a nervous breakdown in the 90s. Like it broke me. Debbie, you know that.
I know. Yeah.
I didn't want to live anymore. I mean, it really, when your parents walk away from you and abandon you, it is just unspeakable. And they lived around the corner.
Right.
I would watch my dad drive past my house and I'd watch him go to church every Sunday.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation.
That's a whole nother conversation.
Right? Broken people do broken things. We live in a broken world because I know some people it's hard to forgive. Even they're angry at God because why would God allow this to happen? Again, that's another conversation, but we have to look at the fact that God created this world and sin entered it and it has so it's broken and the enemy of our souls is alive and well trying to destroy everything God created. And so we have to remember that hurt people do hurt people. I mean, that's
Right.
just
And
a
God
reality.
did not make this happen.
Right.
God wanted reconciliation for my family. God is a God of reconciliation. I know that even though I felt angry towards God, it was more like I was talking to like a good father and I was crying, going, fix it. You can fix it, fix it. But
Right.
I know God did not make this happen. This is not what God wanted for me as far as being in this broken place. However, what's weird and ironic, and maybe this is part of what God knew I needed to do, is I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't get out from under my mother's abuse.
And that took you having a healthy boundary and standing up to her and
Yeah.
stopping that as an adult.
Yeah, I mean, I had to because I think she would have done it to my kids. I really think my mother, I can't diagnose her, but I just think there was just some really deep mental illness there for her.
To wrap up, because we don't want to just leave it here, let's talk about steps because as a therapist, you advise your clients in how to walk toward forgiveness. And you yourself have gone through programs to help you forgive your parents and other people who have hurt you. So, can you talk a little bit about the steps that you advise women to take or men when they have someone to forgive, how to move toward that forgiveness? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Mm. Well, again, I'm going to go back to you're probably not going to want to. You're going to want to hold on to what they've done to you. And I would say 95% of my practice are Christian, men and women. Even if they're not a believer, I'll say, like, do you believe in God? Do you have a higher power? Because we really do need God in it. I honestly have not seen someone who doesn't have a relationship with God have the ability to forgive someone. That might be a bold thing to say, but
Mhm.
the people who choose to hold on to the unforgiveness are the ones that really struggle and they kind of remain stuck and they can't let go. So what I would say is really start with that honest place of saying, I don't want to do this. I don't know how to do this. God, would you help me to do it? I would start with that. I also would recommend, like, it can be really helpful, and I forgot that I did this, but I went to a retreat, a 12-step retreat, and it was really therapeutic for me to write letters. I wrote letters to my mother and really just free associated, meaning that I just there were no periods or commas. I just wrote out to my mother and got my anger out and said, this is what you did to me again, right? Because you're not going to get what you need from that person,
And
possibly.
you didn't send it. These are not to
Oh,
be
no.
sent. I'm just
This,
telling the audience, we don't send
right,
these letters. We just cathartically write these letters.
right, right. I don't know. Maybe some people have. I mean, there is a time you can, but you have to really think about how you write it. But anyway, for me, sitting and I had it, I still have the journal, and it was just pages and pages of me pouring out what you did to me and my anger and how it felt, and just really writing to my mom, to my dad, writing to God, lamenting. We need to lament. We need to
Yeah.
lament and get it out. So that's a really therapeutic way to do it. Coming to a therapist or a counselor and really just saying everything that you need to say, a safe place to come where you can emotionally talk about things, right? Where you can learn that it's okay to feel anger. God says, do not sin in your anger. He doesn't say you can't feel angry, right? He doesn't want
Correct.
us to
Yeah.
sin in our anger because he knows it wouldn't be good for us. It'll just lead to harm if we sin in our anger.
Right.
And so, coming to a therapist or a counselor and venting and getting it out and talking. So these are steps. Number one, honestly, the number one thing is just admitting it. I
Yeah.
I can't forgive this
Admitting the
person.
truth of this.
Right.
Right.
I can't, they don't deserve it. They should be punished. Just really going to that raw place of just admitting it and what you're feeling and what you're experiencing. I'm going to put a shout out to Dr. Allison Cook, who is a therapist. I love her. She has a book out, but she'll say, stop saying I shouldn't feel this way. And I love that. And I tell my clients, don't go to that place. I shouldn't feel this way. No, you need to feel this way. You need to get it out. You need to do the work. It's like a purging. You've got to purge it. And you need to sit with a safe person who's going to sit with you in it, right?
Yeah.
There are steps to forgiveness. It's not this magic wand. You've
Right.
got to get all those toxins up and out.
Yeah.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
then God will transform your story. He'll transform it. He really will. He did for me. He did for me. I had such hatred in my heart, such hatred in my heart that I turned it inward onto myself. And people will do that. Why do you think people struggle with alcoholism and drug addiction? At the root of that is shame, resentment, anger, unforgiveness. And I know because I do work with people who struggle with addiction.
Yeah. We're going to have an addiction counselor actually on in a couple of weeks. He talks about addiction and caregiving and how
Yeah,
often that can go hand in hand.
sure.
God definitely will lead us through a transformation process as we come to him with this, being honest about our feelings, first of all, of not wanting to forgive or feeling resentful. And it's easy to say, oh, well, Jesus forgave us, so I need to forgive somebody else. But it's actually a difficult process to go through. And honestly, it was a painful process for Jesus because he had to die on a cross to forgive us. If we stop and think
Right.
about that.
Right, exactly. And actually, that did help me, believe it or not. Like, how did Jesus deal with his persecutors? Like, he just stood there. He didn't defend himself. But I do want to say this one thing that came to mind. Like, healing, forgiveness, and forgiving is like healing like a horrible burn. Like, you were burned horribly. That's a transformation process, right? Like they have to
Correct.
do like skin grafts and do all like it's like steps. I mean, it's more
A
than like
long
it's
process.
a long process. And that's how it is with unforgiveness. Unforgiveness burns. It's like this burning anger, right? And
Yeah.
so it isn't this one and done thing. It's this process. It's layer by layer by layer. And it's not something that's going to be an overnight thing. So don't be hard on yourself if it's like a year later and you're still in this wrestle.
Yes.
It's going to take time. God just says, I'm just asking you to be willing. I'll do the rest.
Right. Right. And
I'll
I
do the
think I've
rest.
been through some of the forgiveness processes with a prayer ministry at my church where we talk about coming to God with unforgiveness because unforgiveness is going to hold us back. It's going to hurt our bodies and minds, but it's also going to hold us back in our life, moving forward often.
Mhm.
Because we do get into these cycles of depression or anxiety. But one of the things they say is understanding that unforgiveness and the thing that happened to us is a burden that we're carrying, and we can bring it to Jesus and say, "This is too heavy for me. I
Yeah.
cannot carry it. Will you carry it for me?" And
Yeah.
he says yes, because he will. And then we ask him to transform our minds, to forgive the other person, and even saying, "I can't forgive them, but Lord, if with your help, I want to choose to forgive." And then he does the work in us and through us to forgive that. And it's amazing to me that it takes a while, but eventually one day, and you've experienced this too, you think of that person or you think of that incident, and it doesn't make you react like it always made you react. And all
Hmm.
of a sudden you're like, I think I'm on the other side of this. Occasionally, you can get triggered about something, and when you do, you just take that back to God and go, this is still an issue. Show me where I need to forgive more, or lay this at your feet, or work through something with you, God, so that I can move forward." But so, I mean, it's a long process, but it is doable, and it does change our lives for the better. I've watched you come alive.
Right. And remember, God is a God of justice. And I will say this to the women listening, right? One of my favorite names for God is El Roy. And that means I am the God who sees. God has seen everything that has happened to you. God has not turned his head away. God has not forsaken you. He's not abandoned you. He knows. He is a God of justice. And I can assure you that he sees and that he knows.
Do you have any last words about forgiveness that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yes, I do. I wanted to end with, if we choose to forgive someone, especially someone who has hurt us or just continues to cross our boundaries, um, I just want to say that it doesn't mean that just because we forgive someone doesn't mean that you have to go back into relationship with that person. Because once we forgive someone, then especially someone who's harmed us or hurt us in a really deep way, there has to be a process of trusting that person again.
And
Right,
rebuilding
so
trust.
yeah, you have to rebuild. You can choose to, or you can, scripture says, as far as it is with you, live at peace with one another. And so, it doesn't automatically mean you have to feel responsible to be in relationship. And this goes for family too, because a lot of times you hear things like, well, family is blood. But it doesn't necessarily, if somebody's abused you or harmed you and hurt you in some way, forgiveness doesn't automatically mean that you go into relationship with them. I
Or
just want,
stay in
right,
that
or
relationship.
right. I just want to be clear. Like with my experience, I chose to be in my father's life. My father neglected me emotionally. He didn't rescue me out of that situation, but it was my choice to do the work I needed to do so I could have closure with that relationship with him. I really love my dad, but that's something to process maybe with a counselor or a trusted pastor. But, sometimes forgiveness is going your separate ways as well, especially if you're dealing with a difficult person. It would take time to rebuild trust. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, I guess we can pause there for today, because we can talk on this subject for hours.
Oh
But
yeah.
we just thank you for being with us today and sharing your story
Yeah.
about walking through your own unforgiveness in this particular circumstance, and how that affected you, and how forgiving also gave you a new release on life and health, and allowed you to move forward. So I'm so
Yeah.
grateful to have you be on the show today.
Yeah, and because I've seen the effects of me choosing to forgive, I now choose to do it over and over and over again. And every time I'm like, I don't want to. But when I surrender, I'm glad that I did.
Yeah. I think it's a great thing. Well, I'll link where you can find Mel in the show notes, and we just encourage you ladies, reach out to Midlife Crescendo, leave a message if you want to comment on the show, if you want to ask another question about forgiveness and unforgiveness. If you have a question or just a comment, we welcome that. And we'll wrap it up for today. Thanks so much for being with us today, Mel.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you, Debbie.
I hope you were able to glean something from my conversation today with Melanie. Her own experience in trauma and then being a trauma therapist informs her insight. Let's face it, we all have things we need to forgive, and we all need to be forgiven at times. I know I have needed both. Unforgiveness takes an emotional toll in our lives, even when we don't realize it initially. So that being said, I encourage you to take a few minutes today and this week and ask God if there's someone in your life that you need to forgive. Ask Him if there's anything you haven't forgiven that is standing in your way of His abundant life for you that keeps you from fully healing or moving forward into your best life in this midlife season. Just ask Him. I know He'll answer. And if it's a difficult conversation for you to have, I encourage you to seek out a counselor, a pastor, or a trusted friend that you can have this conversation with. But here's the other thing. God won't leave you there in your trouble. If you ask Him, He'll help you to desire to forgive and to actually move through the work of forgiving, just as we talked about today. Listen, if you have questions or comments about this episode, please feel free to leave me a message at midlifecrescendo.com. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I love it when we make this podcast more of a conversation. In the coming weeks, we'll be discussing breast health, addiction, and caregiving midlife, and we'll talk about my new audiobook being released later this month. Thanks for tuning in today, and remember, midlife is just a brand new season to find your passion and purpose for your grand finale. Talk next week.